Hello, boys and girls. I'm your host and guide, Thirtyne, and welcome to Secret of Mana. Yep, I did it. I'm going back to the old school RPGs that I played as a kid because you know what? I love them. I really do. And, Secret of Mana is probably second to Final Fantasy VI in, like, my favorite games of all time. Or at least games I grew up with. Now, it loses a few points because I didn't actually have the game until, like, I was older, and I only really got to play it through friends. But I was always a much bigger fan of the action-style RPG that the Mana series had. Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore, you know, those type of games. You know, the kind of Legend of Zelda type gameplay, which is weird because I wasn't a huge Legend of Zelda fan. But enough about that. Let's get this game started here. Alright, new game. Now, a little bit of trivia about the characters, right? The heroes in the game, they don't actually have canon names. But or at least they say they don't have canon names. However, in the original Japanese instruction manual, while not officially stated as being canon by Squaresoft, which is weird because you think they'd have been the ones that made the instruction manual, seeing as how they're the ones that made the game, right? It does give each of the characters, right? There is a name written in there for each of the characters. In the American instruction manual, they're just listed as spoilers for those who haven't played it, but they're just listed as boy, girl, and sprite. In the Japanese one, the boy, the hero of the game, is named Randy, so that's the name I'm gonna give him. Kinda boring, but whatever. Deal. Now, another cool thing about this game is being made by Squaresoft, right? Who originally was kind of going under, and they released Final Fantasy because it was going to be their last game. Everyone knows that story, and how it then, you know, it became huge. It blew up. Final Fantasy was super popular, which allowed them to stay in business, and they kept making more and more Final Fantasies. Which is why, you know, people make fun of the name. Oh, it's the Final Fantasy. Why is there so many of them? But it was going to be their last game. Secret of Mana, which is actually the second game in the series, was originally going to be a Final Fantasy game, right? It's supposed to be part of the Final Fantasy series. Sorry, not Secret of Mana, but its predecessor, right? So that would have been, in Japan, Secret of Mana is Seiken Densetsu 2. So number 1 would have been part of the Final Fantasy series. And in America and Europe, it was actually released with a Final Fantasy name. Only to later be released with a Mana name. And that was when it came out later, and I think it was the Game Boy Advanced. It might be the DS, but I don't think it was quite that far along. As Sword of Mana, but originally a Final Fantasy game. So there will be, and you will see, a lot of similarities between Secret of Mana and some of the old school Final Fantasies. Like, you'll get to see Moogles and the dwarfs that were in Final Fantasy IV, right? And a few other things like that. Chocobos make an appearance in the Secret of Mana games, while not a big part, they do kind of appear here and there. Now, one thing all the Mana games have that keeps them in common with each other, that separates them from the Final Fantasies. The Final Fantasy games are all based around crystals. It's the crystals of power. You have the crystal of wind, water, fire, right? Whether or not you see them, they all kind of have that same feeling of these are your elements and they're brought to you. Right? And that's people with their magic and stuff like that. At least the old Final Fantasies did. They started kind of phasing that out later, right? Final Fantasy VII kind of did the materia. Final Fantasy VI didn't really have crystals at all, right? And then that's when it started to kind of go away, and it was just exceptional generally children going on their big adventure. But originally it was all about the crystals. The mana games all contain both the mana sword, which we just picked up, hey-ah! And the mana tree. And basically, the mana tree is the equivalent to the crystals. It's what brings magic into the world in the mana games. The sword is then used to protect the mana tree. And in most of the games, bad stuff is happening, the mana tree either needs to be saved, or it has become corrupted and needs to be destroyed, and a hero picks up the sword and goes off to do so. Now you'll notice, if this was originally meant to be a Final Fantasy game, it's kinda different. Right? Just by watching you can see, hey, there's no turn-based battles, we're not getting into random fights. This is... Ow. There's still trees in my way, you can't hit me. But this is very much more Legend of Zelda kind of gameplay. And, that is correct. They wanted to do something a little different, and they were really looking to make a Legend of Zelda kind of game. Right? Steal the, you have your hero moving around, swinging his sword, that kind of game, and well, I believe that's why they ended up making it slightly different than a Final Fantasy game. Or, sorry, that's why they ended up deciding that they didn't want it part of the Final Fantasy series. It'd probably throw off their fans who are going, hey, you know what? This isn't turn-based, this isn't a Final Fantasy game, right? And instead of scaring away people who'd be like, oh, this is different, I don't want to play this, right? Just give it a different title and release it as its own series. That way people can kind of jump into it, not expecting a Final Fantasy game, but still going, hey, I know Squaresoft, they release good games, they're the ones who put out Final Fantasy, and I enjoyed that. So maybe, just maybe, I'll enjoy this too. Even if it does seem a bit different when you start playing. Anyways, unlike Zelda, you can't just go around swinging your sword all willy-nilly and just attacking everything. As you see here, I'm dealing 0 damage, 2 damage. You'll notice there's a little counter at the bottom. Every time I swing, you gotta wait for it to reach 100 again before you can attack. Otherwise, you won't be dealing much damage. Now, I guess that kind of follows the turn-based, you know, kind of balance of the Final Fantasy games, but really, I think it's more just that people aren't just running around spamming their attacks. Now, before we head into the first town, which if you were paying attention at the beginning is where we're going, we're trying to get back home after falling from the waterfall, I kind of want to gain a few levels here. It's not necessary, but we will be fighting a boss fairly early on, and while he's not hard per se, he's really, really irritating if you haven't gained any levels. Actually, he's really irritating even if you have gained levels. But at least if you... I want to get up to at least level 3, so I just want to get one more here. Right? Usually when I'm playing by myself, I'll get up to level 5. Just because that way, you know, I really don't have to have any problems with them. But to save time, and I really don't want to do much grinding here. Right? I'm probably going to try and go through the game without any grinding at all. Or as little as possible. And the grinding that I do end up doing will mostly all be off screen. I just felt like I wanted to talk about the difference between Final Fantasy and the Mana series and, you know, get that all out of my system before we actually enter the game. But we haven't seen any magic yet, and yes, magic will be in this game. And while the sword, you kind of have to, or your weapons, you're gonna have to, you know, hit the enemies, make sure you're next to them. Right? You can't just swing your sword and have it hit. This isn't Final Fantasy. Right? Magic is auto-hitting. You target someone and it just deals damage. Well, the reason the first boss is such a pain and I want to gain some levels, he likes to spam magic. Yeah, he'll go, oh, I attack you with this attack. Oh, now I use this one. Oh, now this one. And you basically get up from the attack and get hit by another one. And because it's auto-targeting, you have no choice but to take all the hits. So, gaining a few levels gives you a little bit of extra health so you can survive them a bit longer. And so, that's why level 3, I think we can go into the boss without too much problem if we at least reach level 3. That's not what I want to do. Alright, hold up a second. 1 second, guys.